dual aspect monism. How did you come to think about dual aspect monism?
So this was a project that I started with Harold Atmanspacher. So I was looking into some stuff about John Wheeler and also about Arthur Eddington and some other thinkers, and it seemed to be emerging that they were defending something like a dual aspect monism. So dual aspect monism, the idea is that it's usually formulated in terms of mind and matter, right? There's the famous mind matter problem. What's the relationship between them? Um, And dual aspect monism says that, well, they're actually not distinct fundamentally. Fundamentally, there is no mind and matter. There's just a single thing. And there are two ways of thinking about dual aspect monism. There's one which is sort of the Russellian, um, phenomenalist, Markian approach, where you say that there's one neutral kind of stuff, right? So it's like a neutral monism, and everything is built from the same neutral stuff, like almost an atomic approach. The approach we take, and I think is the same as the one taken by um, John Wheeler and Arthur Eddington and some other people, and David Bohm, very much David Bohm, is that there's a totality. So this is what Bohm would call the implicate order, which doesn't have any differentiation in itself. Right? It has no specific qualities. It contains all of the qualities. And then the idea is that this is split in some way, and that's when you get the qualities. So Bohm would say that it sort of unfolds, and then you get the explicate order from this unfolding. So it's a splitting of a neutral substance into these pieces. So it's a bit more like Spinozist kind of dual aspect monism, where you split it into these different attributes. And this fits Wheeler's approach, because what Wheeler does, so remember I said there's no way the world is out there, and then you make a split, and you have to ask a question, and then it gives an answer. You split into subject and object. So that's sort of the idea. The splitting is not fundamental. There are many ways you could do it. What's fundamental is this strange, ineffable, what Harvey Brown called this ineffable sort of reality that gets split. And in order to gain knowledge, we have to do that split. And that's where the limitation that you mentioned earlier comes from. So that's the approach that we were thinking about. And then we ended up writing a book on the subject, looking at all of the different approaches we could find, sort of decent, fairly worked out approaches we could find in physics that could be cast in these terms. And Harold Amenspacher, who I wrote the book with, his expertise is sort of Pauli-Jung correspondence. So Carl Gustav Jung, the depth psychologist, was also interested in ontological issues towards the end of his life. And he had something very similar. And Pauli was also developing something very similar. And they had a huge correspondence where they developed something incredibly close. Not incredibly close. It basically was a version of this theory where there is a psychophysically neutral realm in which mind and matter emerge. So it's amazing to read this. The way physicists think about Wolfgang Pauli is this extremely hard-headed, no-nonsense mathematical physicist. And then you look at those, it's almost like finding Newton's alchemy documents. You look at the letters he was writing to Jung and also his research assistants, who were also into this depth psychology and these alchemical ideas again, actually. And it's a very different Pauli that you see, very mystical, concerned with his dreams, with symbology and all of these kind of things. So there was a discussion of that in the book. Definitely fits the bill. Eddington and Einstein are put together in the book because they have this same idea that at bottom there is just bits of information, zeros and ones, and you ask the questions. We have Basil Hiley is still going and working on the approach that he was doing with David Bohm, which is the implicate-explicate order stuff. So we put those all in the frame of this version of dual aspect monism that we develop. And we also include the idea that this has something to do with sort of the creation of meaning, because when you create this split, there are quite obvious connections between the things that are decomposed from this fundamental thing. This is the problem of the mind-matter interaction, is precisely that problem. Why are they linked? Why do they seem to be so closely linked? Well, because when you split this thing, you expect there to be correlations. Just like when you split a quantum state, an entangled um, quantum state that's in a singlet state, you expect those anti-correlations because they're from the same thing, and they have to preserve the angular momentum equals zero and so on. So you expect it because of how it's been split in the first place.
I had no idea. Sorry.
Well, you carry on.
No, I was just gonna ask you to expand on the Pauli and Jung correspondence. That blew me away that there was a connection there.
Oh yeah, there's a couple of nice books with I think maybe the complete letters. Beverly Zabriskie has a book on this, and I think there's another one. I forget the editor now. So what they're talking. So the story is Wolfgang Pauli had a bit of a nervous breakdown at one stage. So he was he was dating a cabaret dancer, which is a great idea. So a good way to have a breakdown in the future. And it all went terribly wrong, and I think she had an affair. And it was suggested, I think his father suggested, because obviously he's from Zurich as well, so his father suggested that he went he should go and see Jung. Jung didn't see him at first. He sent him on to his assistant, Marie-Louise von Franz, to go get analysis. And they had a bit of a thing going. I think she was a bit infatuated with him, actually. And then eventually he had analysis, and then he gets involved with Jung, mostly through correspondence. And he's sending lots of his dreams about, I think he claims that it looks like his discovery of which one was it? One of the violations of one of the symmetry principles. He kept dreaming about symmetries and which one is it? The violation of in the beta decay, that experiment. Anyway, so there was I can't remember which one it was now, but there was some famous result that he came up with, which apparently comes from his dreams, basically. So he's sending all of this symbology, and they wrote a book together. It was separate chapters, but they actually wrote a book together on synchronicity. So he was completely into this idea of synchronicity. It's famous effects, this famous situation where Pauli used to go into laboratories, and his mental state was so anxious about experiments and experimental equipment that everything in the laboratory would go wrong whenever he went in there. So there's this idea that, what's going on inside is captured by what's going on outside, and he had such sort of strength of thought about everything would go wrong that everything did go wrong in the laboratory and all the experiments failed. So he had all of these kind of things, these ideas going on. And then they start looking into ancient alchemy. So Pauli starts looking into Flood and Kepler and their alchemical works, and he actually has a chapter on this in the book I mentioned with Jung, which is very surprising if you don't know this kind of stuff already, that he would be writing on mystical aspects of Kepler and Flood, Robert Flood, the alchemist. And their viewpoint was alchemical. The idea was that there is this thing, the unus mundus, which is the one world, this unitary world, which is a bit like what we call the psychophysically neutral realm, and it splits into its parts. And they developed this in their letters at great length. And C.G. Jung's last book, Mysterium Conjunctionis, was an attempt to sort of develop the ontology of this particular view that they were looking at. And it's dual aspect monism. It's this decompositional dual aspect monistic view. There's a totality that gets split. It has to be split because you need a subject and an object to know the world. That's how it's presented. It's very interesting.
So coming back, sorry for that aside, but coming back to meaning.
Yeah. So so basically that's where the meaning comes from. So there's something that links the subject and object that is what emerges when you get this split. That's why we have these meaningful relationships between mind and matter, and between other things that we might find correlated. So it's sort of meaning is the thing that gets generated by this in this decomposition, this relationship between the subject and the object. But I mean, the crucial thing is that we don't take that as sort of ontological. The thing that gets split is not fundamental. What's fundamental is this unsplit, undivided entity, which is the same as David Bohm's thing. He has this book called, what is it, Undivided Universe or something like that.
So then meaning emerges out of the split.
That is the split. That's sort of part and parcel with the split. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, this is, when did we write the book? Like just a year ago. We wrote it in about 3 months, I think, when we realized we had the same sort of viewpoint, and I was studying some things, and then it got written very, very quickly. And we're still sort of, we try and outline some things that you would expect to see if the theory is true. And people used to analyze these things. So this is more Harold's work. He calls them exceptional experiences. If it's true that when you decompose this thing, there are correlations, well, just like with quantum mechanical correlations, you should expect to find statistical evidence of correlation, that they've come from some, initial, whatever, singlet state, if you want to call it that. The mind and matter have come from some singlet state. You should expect to find interesting correlations between the mind and the matter, to do with sort of symbols in the world and synchronicities and things like this. So this is what Pauli and Jung's correspondence go into quite a lot, is the idea of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences between the mind, the inside and the outside. But there's nothing surprising about that if you adopt this dual aspect viewpoint. It's an expectation or a prediction of the view.
And just to go back to the start, so the difference between dual aspect monism and traditional Russellian neutral monism is that Russellian neutral monism doesn't have the split entailed. There's just one kind of thing.
No, the Russellian approach is atomic, essentially. It says that there are lots of things you build. It's constructive. There you build the phenomena, whatever it is. You build an experience of whatever, and seeing an apple up. And there will be two ways of viewing that configuration. One from the inside, subjective, one from the outside, objective, but they're one and the same thing. Even though they look different, they're just aspects of one and the same thing that's fundamentally neutral. And all the world is built from exactly the same neutral set of things. Neutral monism. So it's not decompositional, it's compositional. So the difference with ours is that there's one thing, undivided, totality with no differentiation whatsoever, perfectly symmetrical in every possible way. And then you divide it and break the symmetry in certain ways.
Are you bringing this to bear on contemporary consciousness debate?
That's the idea. So it's a different way of thinking about the hard problem, which is how can it be like this? Well, we've come from the same. The mind and the matter are not fundamental. They come from the same source. So it's a different way of thinking about the relationship between mind and matter. And as I said, there should be predictions that you can make about finding things in the world on the basis that they're in the mind and vice versa. So Bohm was dealing with this towards the end of his life. He had this thing called soma significance. And so he was looking at the relationship between the fact that we could make things happen in the world through the mind, basically. And the obvious example is if we get anxious, we can speed our heart up and things like that. Right? A thought can cause things to happen bodily. And then, well, why is that? Well, because they're one and the same thing. They have the same basis.
Are there like classes of distinctions of how you can observe this in the world?
Well, so, I mean, Harold's done some pretty systematic work with another colleague of his, Wolfgang Fach, where they're just trying to get statistics of these exceptional experiences. So the idea is not to take them as having any significance. So it's people that have what they would call paranormal experiences, which is not very nice. You don't want paranormal experiences in a scientific discipline. What you want is normal and natural qualities. So at no stage do we want to be leading into things that are paranormal. The idea is to bring certain features that have been called paranormal into the realm of ordinary study and look at the statistics. And weirdly, just like with cybernetics, this used to be a common thing. It used to be completely normal, even in the 60s, probably ended around the 60s, to study interesting experiences, mystical experiences, psychedelic experiences, synchronistic experiences, precognitive experiences. It sounds mad. You can't say this, anything like this these days without sounding unhinged, but it was completely normal for a long time. It's not completely clear that a lot of those experiments were off. I mean, so Jung and Pauli discuss a lot of the experiments that were being done by this guy Rhine. I can't remember the university. And I don't know, it's not completely definitive that there were any mistakes in those experiments or statistical errors or anything like that. So anyway, it's another thing that could potentially be investigated, but people won't probably because um, it doesn't look like the kind of thing you should be looking into if you're a serious academic.
Yeah, yeah. Studying mysticism was always a big part of philosophy, and I guess there's just been the stigma that's been associated now.
Of course. I mean, it's interesting to try and find the origins of all of these things. You know, just like we try and find the origin of the continental analytic splits, and we find that with Husserl and co. I mean, and then what happens is you have people like Heidegger who are on the other side of that split relative to where we would probably position ourselves, who were still investigating interesting things to do with, mysterious things, should we say, the nature of being, and not worrying about whether it looks strange or not, just looking at the nature of being, seeing what follows. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't know why it happened or where it happened. William James was absolutely obsessed with these kinds of phenomena. Um, solid scientists were.